Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
Do you admit to being evil, Richard?
We are all evil in some form or another. Are we not?
I'm asking you the questions, my friend.
Yes, I am evil.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
In addition to the compelling stories Martin and I continue to share here on True Criminals, we're excited to announce a new special series delving into some of the most notorious criminal cases in US history, including Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Eileen Wuornos, Ed Kemper, and the Golden State Killer, to name just a few.
These will be available on our usual platforms with select content released as exclusive specials. To stay up to date with our upcoming release schedule, be sure to follow us on social media. You'll find all the links in our show notes. We're launching the series with The Night Stalker, the chilling case of Richard Ramirez.
In this double episode, we explore the case of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, a serial killer who terrorised California in the mid-80s. In part one, we examine the string of attacks in 1984 and 1985, which sent shockwaves through California and brought terror to the streets of Los Angeles and San Francisco. This is the story of Richard Ramirez, the so-called Night Stalker, a man whose reign of terror claimed victims seemingly at random, men, women, children, and the elderly in a number of different locations across California. In this episode, we'll explore the brutality of his crimes and the unprecedented manhunt that finally led to this serial killer's ultimate capture. And in our next episode, we'll look at Ramirez's trial and the public's morbid fascination with him. After Richard Ramirez was caught and eventually went to trial, media attention seemed to shift from the terror the community felt to the bizarre obsession the public had with him.
It did. There were many aspects of the Ramirez killings that fascinated the public. There were elements of Satanism. Some even thought him to be attractive. He might have been a serial killer, but he was a good-looking serial killer. A handsome devil, you might say. He had hordes of female fans who would send love letters, and he eventually married one of them.
Here's some chilling audio of Richard Ramirez recorded after his arrest, which gives a sense of what he was like.
Do you admit to being evil, Richard?
We are all evil in some form or another. Are we not?
I'm asking you the questions, my friend.
Yes, I am evil.
We'll explore the celebrity serial killer phenomenon in the next episode. But first, Martin, let's talk about the killings themselves. Some really shocking and horrific crimes that came at a sensitive time, really, for California.
Some of the worst crimes. Ramirez's killing spree coincided with a surge in violent crime in the United States, including other serial killings. Notorious cases like the Golden State Killer, Ted Bundy, and Charles Manson were also fresh in recent memory. The FBI reported a 5% increase in crime rates in 1985, and California, already reeling from the Freeway Killer and Hillside Stranglers cases, was on edge, and the so-called Satanic panic of the 1980s only added to that fear.
And it was in this climate of fear that Richard Ramirez, just mid-20s, began killing. His first known victim was Jenny Vinco, a 79-year-old woman who was murdered in her apartment in June 1984. Martin, walk us through the crime scene and the investigation that followed.
Jenny Vinco was found dead in her bedroom by her son, Jack. Her throat had been slashed and she'd been stabbed multiple times and probably sexually assaulted. The killer had also left satanic symbols at the scene, which would become a hallmark of Ramirez's crimes. The police recovered fingerprints from the scene found on the living room floor, which were later identified as belonging to Richard Ramirez. At this point, all police knew was that this was a skilled killer. The pathologist who performed the autopsy on Jenny Vinco believed that the murderer had experience at killing and was good at it. Of course, that suggests that Jenny Vinco wasn't the first murder victim. The investigation was slow to start, but police eventually linked this crime to a series of brutal attacks across LA.
And what was the impact on the public, Martin?
As the attacks continued, the public became increasingly fearful. You can understand that, I think. The press dubbed the killer the Night Stalker. The satanic symbols and the brutality of the crimes created a sense of fear and unease. The police, of course, were under pressure to catch the killer, and the media was filled with stories of the Night Stalker. It was a time of great anxiety in Los Angeles.
Lock your doors, lock your windows. If you have the ability to provide additional security devices, then by all means do so.
Who wants to be next? I don't.
I know his crimes were all quite different, but what were Ramirez's methods, if you like, and the victims he targeted?
There really wasn't much of a pattern, which complicated the investigation. And to begin with, detectives didn't really readily link the attacks. Ramirez's methods were incredibly varied. He used guns, knives, and even a tire iron to attack his victims. He also targeted people of all ages. That was rare as well. People aged from 16 to 83. His victims were both men and women, and he showed no discernible preference for any particular type of victim. If there was a consistency, and that's something that detectives always look for, it was that he often attacked in the early morning, entering homes through open windows or unlocked doors, and a burglary was usually part of the crime. He stole from victims to fund his drug habit. The other common thread was that his attacks were often particularly violent and ritualistic. He would leave satanic symbols at the crime scenes, and in some cases, he'd mutilate his victims' bodies.
The other thing he did, Martin, other than kill, was there a number of occasions when he abducted small children as young as 6 who were sleeping in their beds at night and would drive them somewhere, sexually abuse them, and then just abandon them and tell them to find their way home.
Yes, we talked about victims aged 16 to 83. They were the victims on which he was convicted, but there were these other cases. Police were pretty convinced that he was behind those abductions of youngsters, but he was never charged with them.
Tell us about some of the other murder victims.
We've talked about Jenny Vinco, the second victim, and this wasn't until 9 months after Jenny Vinco's murder, was the 17th of March 1985, shortly before 11 p.m, Maria Hernandez, who was 20, entered the garage of the condominium she shared with her roommate, Dale Okazaki. This was in Rosemead, a city in LA County. As she unlocked the door and the garage door was closing, Ramirez surprised her from behind and held a gun to her head. She turned and raised her hands to shield her face. Ramirez fired the gun, the bullet deflecting off the key she was holding in her hand, and she fell to the floor. Her roommate, Dale Okazaki, who was 34, was then murdered in the kitchen. Ramirez went into the condo and shot Okazaki in the forehead at close range. Hernandez remarkably survived the attack, and she later identified Ramirez in a lineup.
I think when Ramirez left the condo, he bumped into Maria and realised that he hadn't killed her, and she must have thought a number was up at that point, but he just walked away. And that's incredible, isn't it, that she was saved by the bullet deflecting off the key, and then he didn't finish the job and she lived.
Very difficult to explain why he didn't finish her off. But by the time it came to his trial, his defence tried to argue for some leniency in the sentence because he had let some of his victims live.
Extraordinary. And what about Tsai Lian Yu, murdered just an hour after the attack on Hernandez and Okazaki?
Yes, it was very soon after that attack, but it was quite different circumstances. She was pulled from her car and shot twice in the chest at close range. A witness saw the attack and noticed the number plate of the vehicle driven by Ramirez. The witness later identified Ramirez in a lineup again. The bullet used to kill Yu was fired from the same gun that killed Dale Okazaki. If you follow us on social media, you may have already seen the news. We're incredibly proud to share that True Criminals won Outstanding Independent Podcast at this year's True Crime Awards. The award is with us in the studio today.
Yeah, we're incredibly proud. And if you haven't already, do follow us on Instagram and check out the moment we found out. We've saved it in our highlights under awards.
We were also honoured to be joined on the night by two very special guests. Mark Dyer, grandson of Muriel Mackay, whose story we covered in our third episode, Muriel Mackay, Kidnap, Ransom, Murder. Carolyn Woods, victim of serial fraudster Mark Acklam, featured in our two-part episode, Sleeping with a Psychopath.
We really wouldn't be where we are today without these incredible guests, and Carolyn's reaction to our win was absolutely brilliant. I think she might have been even more excited than we were, so a heartfelt thank you to everyone who supported the show. It means the world to us, and most importantly, to the victims and families whose stories we are privileged to tell. As police raced to catch up, Ramirez's attacks continued through the spring and summer of 1985. He targeted elderly couples like Vincent and Maxine Zazara, murdered on the 27th of March 1985, and he also attacked young families like the Covenants on the 20th of July 1985, just a few months later.
Yeah, his attacks were really speeding up at this point. The Zazaras were found dead in their home, with Vincent shot in the head and Maxine stabbed multiple times. Ramirez also mutilated Maxine's body, cutting out her eyes, one of the grimmest episodes of all his attacks. The Covenants were attacked in their home, with Chanarong shot in the head and killed, and Somkid, his wife, raped and sodomized, but she survived. Ramirez also tied up their 8-year-old son and hit him. The brutality of these attacks is still shocking. And there were several more. The assault of 66-year-old Bill Doll and his disabled wife, bludgeoning and raping 83-year-old Mabel Bell and her 81-year-old sister, raping 42-year-old Carol Kyle in front of her 11-year-old son, stabbing widowed grandmother Mary Louise Cannon to death, she was 75, and more than 20 others, all similarly horrific and depraved attacks.
There were some incredible detectives, Martin, on this case, including Gil Carrillo, who was one of the lead detectives. And he was desperately, I think, trying to work out whether there was a link with these killings that were happening in random parts of California, all with a slightly different MO. And I remember watching, actually, on the Netflix documentary about it, he talked about the fact that the Night Stalker had cut out Maxine Zazara's eyes, and he remembered something that he'd learnt at police college about fear. And one thing that he noticed about all these crimes is that the victims perhaps were shot in the face, and he began to wonder whether they were looking for one man and whether it was the fear that he would get off on his victims' faces.
He was a very sharp-eyed detective. But even though he was beginning to come round to the idea that these attacks were all the work of one man, he was still up against the opinions of his colleagues, and it was some time before he managed to persuade them that they were looking for a serial killer.
So Ramirez was able to evade capture for months. What finally led to his arrest?
A combination of good police work and some luck. The investigation was a complex and challenging one. Initially, given the range of victims and styles of killing, police believed they were dealing with multiple suspects. But as the evidence mounted, they began to realise they were looking for a single serial killer. Gil Carrillo, a detective with the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, put up the theory that a single killer was responsible, but his colleagues were sceptical because of the erratic MO of the killer.
And although he seemed to leave little evidence behind, shoe prints played a big role in convincing them that it could be the same person, and quite distinctive shoe prints.
Bad luck for him, Ramirez left a distinctive shoe print at 2 of the crime scenes. Detectives discovered that these matched to a specific pair of Avia sneakers that weren't common at the time. They found that only 6 pairs existed in the men's size 11.5 in the United States, with 5 of them sold in Arizona and 1 sold in a shoe shop in Los Angeles. It seemed clear, remarkably, that the 1 pair of its size and kind in the state of California belonged to the killer. Unfortunately, the information leaked to the press. Damn journalists, eh? Mm-hmm. Ramirez saw a press conference about the shoe and gun evidence, and that gave him the opportunity to destroy crucial forensic evidence. He dropped his sneakers over the side of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco.
But then detectives got a crucial break in the case.
They did. James Romero, a witness, came forward, reporting seeing an orange Toyota station wagon in his neighbourhood. It matched the description of a vehicle linked to the Night Stalker. The police were then able to track down the vehicle and collect a fingerprint, which they matched to Richard Ramirez. The identification of Ramirez's print was described as a near miracle because the system used to identify him was recently installed and contained the fingerprints of criminals born after the 1st of January 1960. That was only 2 months before Ramirez was born.
And how did the police finally arrest him?
Ramirez was captured on the 31st of August 1985. The arrest followed his mugshot being released to the media. He was in Arizona visiting relatives and unaware that his photo was being circulated. When he returned to LA, he was recognised by locals and chased down by the public. And that says an awful lot, I think, about how the public was so gripped and fearful of this killer on the loose. The idea that he would simply be recognised in the street. He attempted to steal a car and was eventually subdued by members of the public who beat him with a metal gatepost and barbecue utensils. Extraordinary arrest. The police arrived and took him into custody.
We can hear a bit of Ramirez being interviewed in custody.
A lot was made that you're a devil worshipper. Do you worship the devil? Have you ever studied Satanism?
There are different sects of Satanism.
Have you just yes or no? Have you studied Satanism?
Yes, I have.
Are you a worshipper of the devil?
No comment.
Well, we'll explore what became of Ramirez in our next episode. But Martin Richard Ramirez was eventually convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempts at murder, 11 sexual assault-related charges and 14 counts of burglary. But police actually believe he could be responsible for many, many more than that.
Yes, there were a series of child abductions in those same years, 1984 and 1985, that investigators believe Ramirez was responsible for. But they chose not to pursue those charges to protect the young victims from having to give evidence.
Martin, a story like this I always find quite extraordinary and bewildering here because, thank goodness, we haven't really had many in the way of serial killers here, have we?
No, I mean, nobody does serial killers like America. I remember reading a survey of serial killings, and North America is by far the country that just has so many more. Russia is second in the number of serial killers, and remarkably, and I find this difficult to believe, that the UK comes third. We have had some notorious serial killers. Fred and Rose West, we featured on an earlier episode, who preyed on young women and even their own children. But that seemed to be a unique story about a depraved couple working in an almost domestic situation. We had the Ipswich killer, Stephen Wright, who killed a number of women, including sex workers. They weren't all sex workers, but that was over a kind of short period, although he is now facing trial for a more historic murder. But at the time we covered that case, the Ipswich prostitute murders, we called them, they all happened within a very short time span, almost a spree rather than the work of a serial killer. I suppose the one case that you could compare with the more notorious serial killers in the United States is Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, who killed 13 women across Yorkshire and the northwest of England in the 70s and 80s. He was eventually caught, but he was on the prowl for a very long time, several years. And during that time, I do remember, because I covered it to a certain degree, I do remember the fear and panic that he spread around that part of England that you can compare to the fear and loathing of people in LA and LA County at the time that Ramirez was killing. And of course, Ramirez was killing, as far as police know, for little more than a year. The Yorkshire Ripper case went on for 4 or 5 years.
I think what's different as well about the serial killers we've had is there was more of an MO. What was very different about Ramirez was each case seemed so different. Although there were common themes, perhaps some satanic rituals mixed in there, the cases didn't seem to have any rhyme or reason in terms of a pattern, did they?
No, police always look for an MO of a killer, and it really does make their life a lot easier. But it doesn't always apply. And I suppose the most notorious case in the last few years in the UK is of Levi Belfield, who was the killer of Millie Dowler, the schoolgirl who was missing for a long time before her body was recovered. But he also killed other women, and his method of attack was different in some of those cases. Some of his victims were bludgeoned from behind, but another victim was run over by his car. In fact, she survived. Millie Dowler, as far as I can recall, wasn't bludgeoned in that sense. She was strangled after being sexually attacked, or police thought she'd been sexually attacked. I think when it came to recovering her remains, the pathologist was unable to detect whether she had been sexually attacked, but they clearly believed that perhaps on that occasion was Levi Belfield's reason, his motive for abducting her. But police, I think at the end of that case, simply came to the conclusion that Levi Belfield was just a very evil individual.
Also, I think sometimes there are similarities in victims. I think the Yorkshire Ripper's victims were sex workers, as were Jack the Ripper's in the 1800s. But again, with Ramirez, everybody was really different. The age range was huge, and then he'd even kidnapped children and just abandoned them, not unharmed. He'd sexually assaulted them, but he didn't kill them. It's very difficult to form a pattern with him and work out that it was one man behind all of these attacks.
Which is why it took a long time for Gil Carrillo, the officer in the case, to persuade his colleagues that they were looking at the work of one individual. And it took him, I think, a while to get to that conclusion. And it's understandable because there was such disparity in so many aspects of those murders.
I hate the phrase golden era, but the 80s in California was almost a golden era of serial killers. There were a lot of cases, weren't there?
There were, and there are lots of reasons put forward to that. The backdrop initially was that there was this general rise in violent crime. So you have to set Ramirez's crimes against that. It's also suggested that this was a time of great urbanization. For many, many years, people were leaving the countryside and moving into cities and towns. But the 70s and 80s were particularly a time of people on the move. They were moving to towns and cities where they didn't know their neighbours, and that gave them, if they were bent on murder or other crimes, it gave them some kind of anonymity to hide behind. There was the growth of freeways. The motorway system was expanding. It gave killers the ability to get away from the scenes of the crimes and perhaps explore victims in other areas. It was an era, too, of hitchhiking. It's much more common in those days, as it was in the UK. It was easier, I think, if you're a killer, to find vulnerable victims. If you're driving around and there are women who are hitchhiking. Now, I'm not suggesting that Ramirez's victims were hitchhikers, but it does explain perhaps why other serial killers were able to persist Somebody else has suggested, somebody who wrote a book about serial killers suggested that killers in the 80s were often children of fathers who'd returned traumatised from World War II. And that played a part in how they developed. Now, on top of all that, throw in the explosion of recreational drugs in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And we know that Ramirez was a drug user. And of course, ultimately, police didn't have at their disposal the kind of forensic tools that they have now.
What makes a serial killer, Martin? I'm sure it's something you've given some thought to over your decades of crime reporting.
I think almost all the experts you talk to about what lies behind people turning into serial killers is some kind of childhood trauma. Now, do you remember we covered in an earlier episode the case of Charles Bronson, a very violent prisoner, supposedly Britain's most violent prisoner? And we spoke to Bob Johnson, his psychiatrist, and I'm not for a moment suggesting that Charles Bronson is likely to be a serial killer, but he is somebody who's shown a lot of violence in his life. Bob Johnson, the psychiatrist who treated him, the one who actually managed to curb his behaviour for a while, was absolutely adamant that when you talk to people like Bronson, but he dealt with killers as well, and some serial killers in Parkhurst Prison, he said that almost all of them, in fact all of them, I think he said, had suffered some kind of childhood trauma that in some way dictated the way they turned out, particularly where they hadn't been able to address that problem or recognise it in their childhood, or for some reason were unwilling to talk about it. He said once you get people like that talking about what happened in their childhood, you can start to address their behaviour.
And of course, in our double episode on Fred and Rose West, Howard Soons told us a lot about Rose and Fred's childhoods. Fred was abused by his father. Rose grew up in an abusive environment. And so often you do need to look back at the childhood, which we will do with Richard Ramirez in our next episode.
Yes, and don't forget, kids or young adults suffer all sorts of injuries, and something else that's often cited as perhaps a cause or a contributory factor to somebody becoming a killer or a serial killer is some kind of brain injury or mental or personality disorders. So it can't always be explained by childhood trauma or abuse. But there are so many different factors that it's very difficult to know precisely what turns somebody into a serial killer.
Such a chilling story. Well, stay with us for what happened next and our exploration of who Ramirez was and what motivated him.
If you haven't already, be sure to follow us on Instagram for updates on episode 2 of The Night Stalker. Coming soon.
Hey listeners, your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Research for this episode was conducted by Becca Stinton. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/truecriminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.